By the 9 and 4, welcome back once more to the library. I am the recorder, and today we are taking a brief look at one of the more ubiquitous creations of the elder races, and one that for most of the realm's history was a harbinger of dark times and strife for the younger races. Of course, I can only be speaking of the various sky cities of the elder races. Now, as you are most familiar with, my perceptive patrons, this will be but an overview of these lofty centers of population and power projection. As the name indicates quite clearly, these are floating population centers with the full range of facilities and infrastructure to be capable of being fully independent and self-sufficient in their operation. The standard sky city measures 5 miles in diameter and appears to be a hemispherical star metal construct capable of full motion and control of its position and course via building-sized exclusion drives. The upper half is covered in buildings of various heights with many dozens if not more floors in each, as is in most cases able to be sealed by a deployable dome, creating a full sphere capable of space transit and being made of star metal more than durable enough to do so safely. Beyond these general traits, each of these floating cities tends to be a unique place, with differing arrangements of buildings, as well as possibly entirely different locations of places such as industrial or commerce centers, power plants, and exclusion drive locations. All of these traits were determined by the original builders or owners of the city in question, as while they were built in a very cookie-cutter fashion, the final parts of the creation process would be held in a stasis until the first owner was present, to allow his choices and desires to be properly reflected in the final work. Such building techniques are not logistically feasible in the current day, as this was done in the time before time, and as such is not possible with time now being a regulated concept. However, there were several common themes for the cities, heavily influenced by the cultures and pursuits of the residents, such as star forts for interstellar or interplanar travelers, archive city for those of intellectual pursuits, theater cities for the patrons of the arts, and so on. Sky cities have generally been considered a tool of the Analar, with very few, if any, mentions of dragons using them or having their own. This is despite it being a well-established fact that they indeed did have quite a large number of them at their disposal. It would appear that the bulk of the draconic sky cities were actually deployed out amongst the stars during the original Expeditus fleet's travels, and can be found on or near many of the worlds within the greater Credelis cluster. Only a few of those appear to have survived the ages, with many now assumed to be ruins on or near many of the planets, or perhaps floating cold and lifeless in the dark between the stars, waiting to be found again in the current age. Regardless of which of the elder races it was constructed by, the great majority of the sky cities were without weaponry of any notable kind, which may seem initially an odd oversight. Odd until you realize that the occupants of the sky city are the weaponry, and defended with either the grace of the Analar or the raw power and might of the dragons. The need for weaponry was seen as superfluous with such forces at hand. That was, of course, until the Wars of Feather and Scale, where we see our first major deviation of the Sky City appear in the record, the Skyfort, or Bastion City. Much smaller, at only a mile in diameter, its heavy armaments and multiple independent defensive systems were a reflection of the new need for the city to be able to defend not only itself, but other sky cities within its flying collective. The difference in size is also a clear indication that the ability to produce the amounts of star metal required for their construction was not present for any larger design to be created in the numbers required for the war. However, there are indications that at least one full-sized battle city was created, fully armed and prepared for any level of conflict. However, these would have been limited in extreme in their production, at most no more than a dozen or so being made. Another variant to see production in use in the run-up to and during the wars was the Siege City, and again, much like the Bastion City, it was a smaller construct with specialized equipment for a new set of functions. In this case, it was the ability to land and literally dig into the designated area and separate while doing so, creating a small city in only a few hours as it settles into its final arrangement. All internal components are designed to shift functions to better allow the occupants to survive in the new location, with the exclusion drives being used to provide the motive force for functions such as trolleys or other transit systems, for example. One extreme example of the Siege City's development that is still in full function today is the capital of the flame-forged Kingdom of Damnitra, which was created using 9 separate siege cities. These were a gift from the elder races to the Flame-Forged, in recognition of them taking their place amongst the civilized races. It also notes the first use or deployment of a siege city, at the time thought to be a unique construct for this task. The siege cities were developed from designs meant for colonization purposes and can be seen across the cluster in limited numbers. However, they were also repurposed to act as forward bases in terrestrial conflicts during the war, primarily for use by the younger races that were in league with one side or the other. These served as hardpoints and center of power and safety in the chaos of the Second War of Feather and Scale, until its end with the coming of Vanson, who often would allow them to become full of those fleeing his devastation before utterly laying waste to them. Thus, there are very few intact examples of them left on the home realm itself, with the capital of Damnitra being a clear exception, having been instead lost in the cursed forests of Damnitra for ages until the Age of Valor, when it was rediscovered. Perhaps the most well-known variant in modern history is one that only saw deployment, if not indeed its development, during the Age of Valor, that being the Siege City. From all available indications, siege cities were a conversion of the standard Sky City, altering the dome from sealing the top of the city to deploying below, allowing the siege city to cover a town or city below it, trapping it. Then using the dome to negate and suppress all magical or divine powers within the sealed off area, it was intended to allow for a quick and relatively unresisted taking of an objective. Armed quite heavily and containing vast hordes of created troops known as Kaitagen warriors, these were a terror when first deployed against the younger races by the then still corrupted Analar and Dragon servants of the Daemon in one of the many attempts at his resurrection. However, it was also during this time that the Valors managed to aid the Dragwa in unlocking the full might of the home city's firepower, turning the siege city attacking at the time into a melting wreck as the weapons created by the best of the Analar swept aside the much less impressive improvised augmentations of the much reduced and weakened slaves of the demon. This, along with several other interventions across the globe by forces hidden in the shadows, waiting to act, saw the total destruction of all examples of this variant by the Age of Valor's end, rendering it a historical oddity and footnote for our reflection. A failed attempt to create a superweapon, doomed to fail by the lack of understanding of the weakened and corrupted elder servants of the daemon, of the might of the ascending mortal gods and those that followed them. Another Sky City of historical note, although no longer in its original form, is the Bastion City that is now known as Crysthold in the center of the floating continent of Criterion. Presumably discovered by Carthus Skychild at some point, the story of its transformation is detailed in an earlier entry for your perusal. In the modern day, Sky Cities are not the object of fear they once were. However, they still take care as to not fly directly above towns or cities, as to not trigger old fears. They are still in common use by the NLR, and more examples of the Dragon Sky Cities are being found amongst the stars every decade. These provide resources for recovery or ready-to-use platforms for colonists, pirates, or those looking to make a home amongst the stars, and will continue to do so for quite some time to come. And with this brief look at the Sky Cities at its conclusion, it is time for me to once again thank you for your time and your interest, my perceptive patrons. As always, it means the realms to me. Thank you. Now, until you once more make your way back to the library for our next entry, I have, as always, been the Recorder. And by the 9 and 4, be well, take care of yourselves and each other.